Mark does not like Facebook now.
Honestly, if we're live, no, I haven't liked Facebook in quite a long time. So, if it wasn't for this ministry, if it wasn't for running pages for churches and in this group for this Sunday school, I would have dropped Facebook like a lead weight a long time ago. So that being said,
Welcome to Facebook Live.
welcome to Facebook Live. Yeah. And I've said this before, it's really unfortunate because Facebook has the best video setup in their app. I mean, that's all these other new social media apps, MeWe and CloudHub and Parler. They don't have the server capacity for the videos, and so you're very limited on what you can do. And I had brief moments in this. I guess the data rate's catching up using the church Wi-Fi and everything. But anyways, so this is the best place to do this and record it and be able to upload it. And then I'll go back later and download it and put it up to an app called Rumble, which is a video sharing app. And then I take it from there and share it on the other stuffs, the other social medias. So we are in 2 Kings chapter 18, and then also 2 Chronicles chapter 29, still doing genealogy of Christ. And today we're going to talk about King Hezekiah, son of King Ahaz. And, Ahaz didn't do a whole lot of good stuff. Burned his children in the fire. So he's sacrificing not just his nation's children, but his own children to false gods. And, I've said this before, when you have bad leadership, God's going to let bad things happen to you. It's a punishment. It's a discipline kind of a thing. We see that all throughout the Old Testament. The Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years because they didn't want to follow God. They didn't want to worship God. And when they got to the point where they were supposed to cross over into the land of Canaan, they all doubted and they didn't trust God. So he made them wander around for 40 years till that whole generation died off. And the next generation came up, and that's when they entered the Promised Land. And so we keep seeing with the kings of Israel, with the kings of Judah specifically, but Israel as well. The kings of Israel basically never got right with God at all. They stayed unfaithful the whole time. Now, the kings of Judah, up and down. This king does it right, the next king does it wrong. Then the next king does it wrong, then this king does it right. And so now we're back onto the king doing it right thing. So King Hezekiah, as we find out either as in 2 Kings 18 or 2 Chronicles 29, there's actually a lot more to this guy. So there's more information. There's several chapters where he's written about because according to 2 Kings 18:3, he did what was right in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestor David had done. And this is important. To compare him to and bring up David is a big deal. And of course, we know David was basically the greatest king that Israel ever had. And still had his faults. He was a man after God's own heart, but he still screwed up and still made mistakes. But he always would repent and come back to God. Solomon did all right, and after that, everything's downhill, right? The kingdom splits, and everything's a problem after that. But let's see here. We'll skip down to verse 7 real quick. With Hezekiah, 2 Kings 18, verse 7, the Lord was with him, and wherever he went, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But he did what was right in the Lord's sight. So after watching his father screw up and make mistakes and go through all that. At the age of 25, Hezekiah becomes king. He reigned for a total of 29 years. And I've mentioned this, and we keep seeing this coming up all through Chronicles and Kings, where these other kings would not tear down all of the high places. You know, like I said, the little mounds, the places where false prophets and false temple prostitutes and everything would go to advertise for their pagan religion from other nations, and they would build these places all throughout. You had they call it Asherah poles. Like I said, if you've ever heard of a modern day maypole, where they had the little streamers and the kids run around and weave the streamers around the pole, that's very similar to an Asherah pole. And, you know, it's weird stuff. They had different pillars, and they had things similar to Native American totem poles. And they had false gods and images carved into them. And so that's what the pagan people would do, and they would build these things all over the place. And as the pagan religions infected Israel, the people of Israel and people of Judah would go and follow after these false gods, especially if the king himself got into it. And that was always a problem for Israel, especially considering their history, when God said, I'll do this for you, and then he proved it, and he actually fought their battles for them. He prepared their enemies, so all they had to do was walk in and kill them, or they ran away before they ever got there. And so you have this tremendous history of God doing these great things for Israel, and they turn their back on him. But we come to King Hezekiah. Let's see here, 2 Kings 18, verse 4. He removed the high places, shattered the sacred pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake that Moses made for the Israelites, and which until then the Israelites were burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. They named it. If you remember that, going back to Exodus, they started getting sick, and they were complaining, having all these issues, and the Israelites got sick. So God told Moses to make an image of a serpent, stick it on a pole, raise it up, and everybody that looked at it would be healed. And I'm not going to get into all that right now, but they kept that, and they ended up worshiping it. And when it says burning incense to it, that means they were worshiping it. Like somehow it was a god, when all it was just a bronze statue. And it didn't even have the power. God had the power. God's the one that healed them. So I think that's a lesson for a whole other time. But verse 5 says, Hezekiah relied on the Lord God of Israel. Not one of the kings of Judah was like him, either before him or after him. So he's like the next King David. It took a long time to get there, but you finally have another king pop up who's on an equal footing with David. So everything he did was right in the Lord's sight, and God blessed him, God blessed Judah. And so he went in during the first year of his reign in 2 Chronicles 29, and he repaired the temple, fixed the temple doors. I mean, it was... all these other kings had worshipped after false gods and false idols, and especially with Hezekiah's father Ahaz, when they started worshiping false gods, and then God turned over Judah to Aram and to the king of Israel. When they came in, one of the first things they did was ransack the temple. A lot of wealth in the temple. There's a lot of the gold and the silver and the different things that they used for the burning incense and for the altars and the scepters and the cups and all that sort of stuff. You go back and study the building of the temple when Solomon built it, and the wood was overlaid with gold, and just a lot of it was really, it would be really neat to see. It would be really amazing to actually see just how beautiful and ornate it was. But none of those kings would keep it up, or when they got turned over to their enemies would come in and ransack and destroy the temple. They'd take all the wealth out of it. And so Hezekiah goes in the first year he's king, and he repairs the temple, he fixes the doors, he gets everything right. He calls in all of the Levites, all the priests, he gets everybody back together, and we're going to start worshiping God again. We're going to start doing the right things again. We're going to start following the laws of Moses. And so he leads them in getting everything back into place, getting the Levites reconsecrated, all the priests, to consecrate yourself is to prepare yourself for worship. It's to make yourself holy. And there's an actual process in the Old Testament, in the laws, Jewish law, there's an actual process of how you do that. And you got to dress a certain way, you got to make so many sacrifices. It's a process. And a lot of that is actually, it's not so much what you do as it is the mindset of why you're doing it. You're doing it knowing that you're going to go before the Lord, so your mindset starts getting right. Because if you remember, when the priests went into the Holy of Holies, if they weren't pure, God struck them dead. Mm-hmm. They had to have a rope tied to their foot and bells on them, and if the bells stopped ringing, stopped jangling, they pull you out by the rope and you were dead. So then you had to go find another high priest to go in there and do it right. So, if you're going to go before the Lord, and that applies to us today. If we're going to go to the altar, if we're going to go before God, even in a church, wherever you're at, if you're going to present yourself to God wanting to be blessed or wanting something, or even just wanting forgiveness of your sins as a child of God. Now, if you're not a Christian, then you are what you are, and when you pray for forgiveness, if that's what's truly in your heart, then God will forgive that. But once you're a Christian, once you're, the Jews that are alive today, if they're really truly going to go before the Lord, they have to consecrate themselves. We have to consecrate ourselves. So you usually hear about it when we have like the Lord's Supper, and you want to be clean. You want to have all your stuff already figured out. And God even tells us that if you're going to go to the altar and you've got an issue with one of your brothers, you need to go deal with that issue before you come back to the altar. So you want the hate gone, you want the jealousy, whatever it is that's going on, you want that dealt with before you go before God, because then your heart's not going to be pure unless you go before God. And as you read through these chapters and you see where not all of the Levites and not all of the priests were getting on board with this, but then they started seeing and realizing what was going on and that this was real, and then they all started getting themselves right again. So you have this massive revival in Judah, and in 2 Chronicles 30, he goes back and reestablishes the Passover, which, again, going back to Exodus, and when they were getting ready to have the Passover, they sent messengers out all over the whole nation of Israel. Not just in Judah, but they went out up into the northern part of the kingdom and said, hey, anybody that wants to come down to Jerusalem and worship and observe the Passover is welcome to come. Anybody and everybody. Let's get right, and let's, come back to the Lord. And a lot of people made fun of them, gave them a bunch of crap, but then a lot of them actually followed and went down to Jerusalem. And the last time you had a really good king in Judah, other tribes left the northern kingdom of Israel and came down and joined them, right? So you have all these people coming back to the Lord, going back to Jerusalem. And something interesting that happened about 4 years into Hezekiah's reign, Israel was still having problems, and then Israel was invaded by the king of Assyria. And he actually conquered and took Samaria. And so Then he came once he conquered Samaria, which took a few years because they did by siege. And when you siege something, you build big walls around their city.
Imagine that.
You don't allow in food
Right.
or resources, and you starve the people out. And they either die or they surrender. And that was what the king of Assyria did with Samaria. And so then he turns around and he sets his sights on Judah. And, you read some of these, when you go back to some of these kings, when they were doing things right by God, they were able to increase their wealth, but they also increased the number of fortified cities. So each city was able to defend itself. So the Assyrian army was massive. It was big, it was strong, it was well equipped. And for them to come into Judah and surround all of these cities that were fortified, this is a problem. That's a big army. That's a lot to deal with. And they set their sights on Jerusalem. And they're going to come after Hezekiah. And this is where he differs from other kings, is that instead of trying to figure out something on his own, and matter of fact, if you read in 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 19, the king of Assyria sent a spokesman, and he's basically telling them, look, you think you're gonna rely on Egypt? Because remember, they had treaties with Egypt and some other places. And you think you're gonna rely on Egypt, and they can't help you. They're only gonna hurt you. And so they knew the history of Judah, and they knew the history of Israel. And they're telling them, you can't rely on your God, you can't rely on your allies, you can't rely on anybody, you're just going to have to surrender and give yourself up. And instead of Hezekiah doing that or trying to get to his allies, he went to the prophet Isaiah, and those two together went to God. And they asked God for help as opposed to asking the nation of Israel for help or asking... Are we having problems? You have a question? If you have a question, stop me if you have a question.
She got her bracelets caught together. And I
Oh.
asked her if she got them untied.
Whoops.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So anyways, and we see in 2 Chronicles 32 that Hezekiah and Isaiah prayed and cried out to heaven. And this is one of those fun things. I say fun things. It wasn't fun for the Assyrians, but God said, because they appealed to God for help, not their fellow man, not some treated ally, they went straight to God. God sent an angel and killed 180,000 Assyrian troops in one fell swoop overnight. One angel. And so when the Assyrians woke up the next morning, there's all these dead bodies all over the place. It's like, oh crap, we done picked on the ones that did wake up. We done picked on the wrong people. God's real again. And so the king of Assyria was named Sennacherib. Sennacherib. I don't know. Anyways, the guy was defeated and was embarrassingly defeated and went back to Assyria. And when he had invaded Samaria, he didn't just kill a bunch of people. He took prisoners and made slaves out of the Israelites that were living in Samaria and shipped them off to a place called Halah. So, that was what he was going to do with Judah and everybody in there. And so Hezekiah had gone in and he did the right thing by God and appealed to God for help as opposed to going to another person, another man for help. And they were successful. Now, again, Hezekiah did what was right in the sight of the Lord. He did the right things. He took down all the pagan worship, he stopped all that in Judah. All that went away while he was king. And so because he was doing those right things, and then he went to Isaiah when they had a problem, and he and Isaiah, which, it's the same Isaiah that we have the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, same prophet. And, they went to God, and God helped them. So, you get right with God, and God's going to fight your battles for you. Doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect. Doesn't mean that, you're going to become super rich and everything, but God will provide not just food, but God will provide defense. Your enemies will flow. We see that. David wrote that all through the Psalms. God goes before me and defeats all my enemies. And that's exactly what happened here. And that's one of the reasons why they compare Hezekiah to David. And you haven't seen a king like David until you get to Hezekiah. David, Solomon, and then Hezekiah. So he's definitely in the top 3 of the kings of Judah.
But there was other kings in between.
Oh yeah, lots of them.
Okay, so they didn't just fall like one after another like that. There was actually other ones between.
Well, yeah, because you had David and then Solomon, and then Rehoboam was king after Solomon, of Solomon's son, and that was where the split happened at the end of Solomon's reign. So you have the northern part of Israel, and then you had Judah in the southern part, and that's where there was the split in the kingdom. And from Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah. So, and we're getting very close to, we've got about 4 kings left until you get to the exile to Babylon. And that's what's interesting, because there's a little bit of foreshadowing of that in Hezekiah's story here when you get towards the end of his reign. But that was probably, oh geez, I have to sit down and figure out just how many years that was from David to Hezekiah. I mean, you're talking about 250 years.
Dang.
Give or take. I have to go back and look at the numbers on that. But, so it's really interesting because Hezekiah gets sick. And if we remember, who was the last king that got sick?
3 weeks ago, I think. Or 4.
Trying to remember.
Are you talking about the one that had the illness in his stomach? And I was like, I wonder if it was cancer.
Yeah, here we go. King Joram of Judah. He got sick of an intestinal disease that he had for 2 years. No, actually it wasn't him. Now, I mean, he did have the one I'm thinking of, though. Might have been King Asa. Anyways, one of the kings got sick, and he didn't go seek God for healing. And the implication there is that had he done so, he would have been healed. Well, Hezekiah gets sick. He becomes ill. And unlike his predecessor, he actually goes and appeals to God for healing from his illness. Because Isaiah comes to him and says, hey, you need to get your stuff in order. You're going to die. You're sick. God told me you're going to die. And so he comes back and, repents and whatever he had going on, and he gets himself right, and he appeals to God and says, hey, look, heal me, help me out here. And so Isaiah, from God says, all right, fine, you get another 15 years. And he healed him from his illness. And so he gets another 15 years added on to his life, plus his reign. So, like I said, he became king at 25, reigned for 29 years, so he lived a total of 54 years. Those extra 15 years, added on to. But during this time, this is what gets interesting, is he's prospering the whole time, and we see this time and time again with these kings. they begin to get kind of arrogant about things, prideful. Hey, look what I've done. You know, realize and understanding, I mean, God is doing it through them. But again, he increases the king's wealth. A kingdom, if you don't have money in your nation, your nation doesn't exist. So you got to be able to have money. You got to be able to buy stuff to protect yourself. You got to be able to buy food. You got to be able to, do all that kind of stuff. So you got to have money, right? So the king's money, which is the nation's money, basically. But Hezekiah became very wealthy, increased the size of Judah, more fortified cities after they got done dealing with the king of Assyria. And word of him being sick gets out. And now all of a sudden we find out about a nation called Babylon. The Jews didn't know who Babylon was or where they were from or anything. And this group of representatives, this envoy, so to speak, this group of guys from Babylon brings gifts to say, hey, we heard you're sick, hope you're feeling better, here's some gifts. And so in Hezekiah's pridefulness, he shows them everything. The trend tells us that in the Bible, he shows off all of Judah's wealth, their treasuries, their armories, everything. He's like, hey, look at all this stuff we got. Check this out. And so Isaiah comes along and says, who are these people? And he says, well, they come from some nation called Babylon. We don't even, they brought me some gifts. And he says, well, what all did you show them? He says, well, I showed them everything. And Isaiah then tells them, well, these are the people that are going to come and conquer your children. They're going to conquer your descendants, and some of your descendants will be turned into eunuchs and be sent off to serve and all this in Babylon. And Hezekiah didn't really catch on. He figured it would be okay because things were going to be peaceful, as it says in the Bible. So he's like, oh, this is a good thing. Like somehow they're going to be allies or something. He didn't quite understand what was being revealed to him. Of course, we know, because we've got that 10,000-foot view. And like I said, we're about 4 kings away from Babylon taking over, which gives us not quite 100 years, 80 to 100 years. Yeah, I'll check the numbers on that. But, so we're not far off from Babylon taking over, and that's where the time of captivity happens. That's that 400-year gap from the Old Testament to the New Testament, until we get Christ. And so, that's going to make for a really, really quick lesson on the genealogy of Christ from King Jeconiah all the way to Joseph. Because there's not much there because there was no king on the throne at that time. But we haven't quite got there yet. And so we find out, again, foreshadowing of Babylon, the foreshadowing of Israel, again, screwing up before God, not being righteous, not doing the things they're supposed to do. But it's almost like that broken record. If you do right by God, He'll take care of you. He will bless you, and He will provide for you, and He'll do things that you're not able to do. So, that's again the takeaway. When things go bad in your life, going back to the way you were before is not the way to do it. It's going back to God is the way to do it when things go wrong in your life. And that's so often we get caught up in our sin and stuff starts going wrong, and instead of getting ourselves right with God, we keep trying to dig our hole even deeper. And that's just not the way to do it. I mean, Hezekiah showed us that. He didn't do what his father did. He didn't do what the kings before him did. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And sometimes that's a tough thing. Like I said, the Assyrians came in and they're sitting there trying to get the people of Judah to turn against their own king by telling them, your God's not going to protect you. Your God's not going to save you. And that's what the enemy does to us. We get doubts. And doubts are okay, but David had doubts, and we read that through the Psalms, but then God shows him that he had no reason to doubt. And so we can sit there and look at our Bibles and read our Bibles and see all these examples of how God has provided for his children. And we need to be reassured by that. And again, we need to take our hope from the Bible and from the example set before us. It's Abraham took the leap of faith, so we only have to take a step of faith.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be it for today, and I hope y'all are blessed, and we'll see you next time. Still don't like Facebook.